All right, welcome back to Fundamentals of Philosophy. This is Module 4 on the Metaphysics of Mind, and this is Lecture 2. In Part 1, we examined the official doctrine of Cartesian dualism. We identified the problem of how an immaterial mind can interact with a material world. We recognized the unsettling epiphenomenal conclusion of this doctrine, and we considered two alternative physicalist approaches: Ryle's logical behaviorism and Churchland's eliminative materialism. In Part 2, we will consider challenges to the frameworks that Ryle and Churchland provide. Do descriptions of behavior and neural activation patterns exhaust what we can say about experience? Or is something important being left out? Back in the 18th century, Gottfried Leibniz, who you might remember from Module 2, asks us to imagine the brain as a mechanism, a literal thinking machine, right? We can imagine this mechanical brain blown up, enlarged to the size of a mill, large enough to walk inside and look around. Inside, you can find mechanical components, physical parts, performing physical functions, gears and whatnot. What you won't find is a single thought, emotion, or color sensation. You're not going to find any of that in there. And over 300 years later, this intuition holds. The most precise imaging of the human brain shows us no dreams, no fleeting moments of sadness or joy, and no felt sense of hope or purpose. Yet these experiences are as certain to us as anything can be. Richard Rorty has said that incorrigibility is the mark of the mental. What that means is it's impossible to be wrong about the contents of your own experience. If someone tells us they are in pain, it's no good to respond that, no, you can't possibly be feeling any pain because your C fibers aren't firing in the right way. That isn't what it means to feel pain. Something's being left out. So Leibniz's point was that a physical description of the brain leaves out something important: the internal phenomenology, or inner sense of experience. David Chalmers calls this the hard problem of consciousness. Why is it that a pattern of neurons firing feels like something at all? Feels like anything? What sort of thing is a conscious experience? Now, this problem isn't hard in the sense of simply being difficult, right? The problem is hard because we have no idea what an answer to these questions could possibly look like. Like Leibniz, Chalmers believes physicalists are leaving something important out of the story. The methods of science are exceptionally well tuned for questions involving quantities: number, volume, mass, velocity. But quantitative data tells us nothing about the felt quality of experience. What philosophers call qualia. Science cannot tell us what an experience feels like from the inside. So that's qualia. That's the felt quality of experience. And here's a few thought experiments that can help make the concept of qualia a little bit more concrete. So humans, us, navigate the world primarily through the familiar senses of sight, hearing, touch, taste, smell. But nature provides other ways of experiencing our environments, other sensory modalities for mapping the world, right? Thomas Nagel asks us to consider what it's like to be a bat. I mean, not to imagine us doing bat things, like hanging upside down in a cave, like Batman or something, but what it's like for a bat to have experiences. What it's like to be a bat from the inside. Bats map the world primarily using sonar, right? Intuitively, this seems like a fairly radically different way of interacting with the environment than what we do. And it should produce radically different experiences, right? Science tells us about Doppler effects and echolocation. But what science can't provide is an objective third-person description that brings us any closer to understanding the first-person subjective experience of the world from a bat's point of view. Nagel's point is this: objective scientific description is simply the wrong tool for describing a subjective first-person experience. No scientific explanation, however sophisticated, can ever describe what it is like to be a bat. There is no objective view from nowhere. We all encounter the world through our privileged access to the contents of our own consciousness and no one else's. We are all alone together in our isolated universes of experience. Nagel is making an essentially epistemological claim here about the limit of what humans can know and communicate about the world. There simply is no vocabulary that can translate private subjective experiences into a meaningful public language. Now, Frank Jackson, in his Mary's Room thought experiment, sharpens this point into an ontological claim, a claim about the world itself. Not about our knowledge, but about the world. Mary is the world's greatest color scientist. She knows every fact that a perfect science could discover about human color perception. But Mary's lived her entire life within a black and white room, and has never actually seen or directly experienced colors. One day, Mary leaves the room and sees a red rose for the first time. Has Mary learned a new fact? If Mary already knows every physical fact about color perception, or ever actually encountering redness, then any new fact she learns upon leaving the room cannot, by definition, be a physical fact. The redness of the rose, its qualia, must represent a non-physical fact about the world. And therefore, Jackson concludes, reductive physicalism is false. There is simply more to the world than physical facts. Nagel and Jackson both demonstrate the hard problem of consciousness that Chalmers is talking about. If Mary can learn a new fact, and if there is something that it's like to be a bat that science can't describe, then physicalism fails as a sufficient explanation for consciousness. Chalmers suggests that this failure indicates that some form of dualism must be true. But instead of Cartesian substance dualism, Chalmers advocates for a more moderate, what he calls property dualism. The world is fundamentally physical, just as science describes it. But when physical systems reach certain levels of complexity, certain thresholds, subjective mental properties emerge that cannot be explained by physical science, by scientific explanations. The work of philosophy, then, is to discover, to figure out what sort of laws might bridge the gap between physical brains and emergent mental properties, to figure out the psychophysical laws that hold them together. Now, qualia theories remain pretty philosophically controversial. The picture that Nagel, Jackson, and Chalmers paint is one where the felt qualities of experience appear as internal phenomena, right? Secured away from scientific measurement by the privileged access of the first-person subjective perspective. While the terminology has become more sophisticated and the arguments are a bit more subtle, there's more than a passing resemblance here between Jackson's qualia and Locke's secondary qualities from Module 3 and Russell's sense data. There's a suspicion that this is old wine served in a new bottle, right? And that we remain spectators trapped within a Cartesian theater, watching a parade of epiphenomenal qualia dance across our mental screen. So David Lewis is going to offer an influential defense of physicalism against Jackson's black and white room argument. And he's going to leverage Ryle's distinction between knowing that something is the case and knowing how to do something. Lewis argues that Mary doesn't learn some new non-physical fact when she leaves the room. Instead, Mary gains a new ability. This is known as the abilities hypothesis. She gains an ability to recognize and imagine a specific color, red. Just as learning to ride a bike involves applying pre-existing skills of balance and coordination. Seeing a new color involves a new application of pre-existing capacities of perception. Now, there's disagreement about whether Lewis successfully answers Jackson's challenge here. But even if we successfully dispense with qualia, this might not in itself be enough to preserve physicalism. Barbara Montero is going to add a further complication, right, for the physicalist. We know what it means for something to be mental, right? We have direct experience of our feelings and sensations. They're right there. And we have a clear sense of what is excluded from the mental, right? Things like chairs and rocks. So we have direct access to the mental, and we can recognize the things that aren't mental. What we lack is a clear sense of what it means to move from describing something as non-mental to describing it as physical. And the reason for this is she's going to invoke a principle originally posed by Carl Hempel, who you'll remember from back in Module 2. So when we talk about the physical, we can't be referring to whatever is described by contemporary physics, because we know that contemporary physics is incomplete. But we also can't use the term the physical to refer to some future physics where all of the relevant questions have been settled, because by definition, we don't know what the future will look like, right? So given that we have a clear sense of what we mean by the mental and the non-mental, we have a clearer sense of that than we have of what we mean by the physical and the non-physical. We don't have a real non-question begging definition of the physical. So why do we feel that there's a mind problem that needs to be solved rather than a body problem? Now, there's another alternate route that seems to avoid both the mind problem and the body problem. What if matter and mind are both built into the foundations of nature itself? Chalmers and Montero have both gestured in this direction in their work, and the later work of Nagel outright endorses it. This is a position called Panpsychism, by the way. Nagel asks, what if matter is simply how the world appears when viewed from the third person perspective, from the outside, and mind is simply that same world viewed from the first person perspective, from the inside? This view, which is known as Panpsychism, has historical roots in the works of William James, Bertrand Russell, Alfred North Whitehead. Panpsychists consider consciousness to be a brute fact about the nature of the universe. Every particle, from the Big Bang onward, has possessed at least some rudimentary form of proto-experience. Now, Panpsychism, which was once considered an outlandish sort of suggestion, has experienced a recent revival in both philosophy and in cognitive science, in part because it dissolves the mind-body problem entirely. There is no mystery to solve, and no dualism to heal. Matter and minds are simply alternative descriptions of the same fundamental reality. So while Chalmers and Lewis disagree about the reality of qualia, they do actually share a fundamental assumption about the nature of the world. Regardless of whether color experiences represent qualia or perceptual abilities, the mental processes that give rise to them are describable more or less completely in terms of the functions they perform. If a computer followed an algorithm that accurately simulated all of the inputs and internal processes of a physical brain, it should produce the same experiences of color, joy, and purpose that a human brain experiences. The fact that the mind program happens to be implemented in meat rather than silicon is ultimately incidental. It is the mental program itself that matters. And that's the idea that we're going to return to in part 3. And I'll see you there.